Good evening, everyone. My name is Mika Loponen, and I am here to talk about orcs, or racism in fantasy. How racist tropes come into the genres of fantasy, how they develop within, and how they got kind of cocooned within the tropes of fantasy, within its concepts and genre settings, so to say. When I did my PhD on this topic about a year ago, I thought it would not become topical very quickly. How wrong I was. Here you can see some shameless plug-in of my PhD on the left. The topic today, like I said, is racism in the fantastic. The discussion is now in the limelight due to Wizards of the Coast removing or at least reducing some of the racist tropes they have in Dungeons and Dragons. And the discussion itself is not a new one. The discussion of racism in fantasy has been there for decades in the books, movies, games of the fantastic. So, Wizards of the Coast is now taking a step that is long overdue, but still extremely important. And while orcs are the trope that is now most heavily discussed, it is, of course, not the only one that should be discussed. Let's go on to the overview of my talk. So, my main points here. Racist concepts have entered fantasy, or the subgenres of fantasy, since the beginning of the genre. Whenever a new author has thought of a race of monstrous being, a race of monsters, they have mainly created those via stereotypes of existing races, existing racial prejudices, existing stereotypes, existing cultural prejudices. So, quite many of the monster races we know were originally based on real world fears and prejudices. And now, once a genre develops, the racist signifiers, as such, they are retained in a kind of cocooned form of the concepts become self-referential in the genre. For example, no matter where a concept draws its roots from, what fears that are embedded in stereotypes of the author's culture at that time, they become self-referential. Goblin becomes a goblin within that genre, orc becomes an orc, and these same signifiers stay with the concepts. And thus, even decades after such portrayals have become unacceptable in any realistic art form, the signifiers stay there for monstrous races, races of the fantastic. And let's start our discussion with orcs, because orcs are currently the main trope that is being discussed, and it is an early one. Unlike quite many other fantastic races, with orcs we can point directly to Tolkien on their birth. Of course, the word existed before orc, orcus, orce. They have been in Beowulf, they have been Roman god of death, they have been sea ogres, they have been whatever, historically speaking. However, the signifiers we currently see within the concept orc, the signifiers that are used when just declaring the concept, this is an orc, they come historically from Tolkien. And now, Tolkien drew quite much of his descriptions straight from, colonialist views at that time, colonialist literature. Many of the signifiers used very much the same you can find when discussing Africans in colonialist literature. Now, here are some examples on how Tolkien described orcs. The black Urks of Mordor, a large black orc, probably Ugluk, standing facing Grishnak, a short crook-legged creature, very broad and with long arms that hung almost to the ground. This could be from any Tarzan book. Long-armed, crook-legged orcs, Shagrat, a large orc with long arms that, as he ran crouching, reached to the ground. On adjectives and descriptions in just The Lord of the Rings, dark, black, black-skinned, swarthy, are used quite many times and always linked to a derogative description, even when not discussing orcs. Slant-eyed, wide nostrils, foul breath, crook-legged, and so on. Tolkien himself described the orcs as resembling a version of Mongol types. To quote, that least lovely race to the European view, approximately, which of course is not better. However, the descriptions here are directly how Africans were described in colonial literature. To continue, other traits that were used similarly: linguistic simplicity, like I'm Ugluk, I command, I return to Isengard by the shortest route. They themselves contrast themselves with humans with speech like, if you are afraid of the Whiteskins, run. The Whiteskins are coming. The insults to each other, for example, ape. Lord of the Rings doesn't have that many apes, but the orcs still go on with that. They are portrayed as willing, brutal slaves with man-eating tendencies. We are the fighting Uruk-hai. We are the servants of Saruman the Wise, the White Hand, the hand that gives us man's flesh to eat. I am Ugluk. I have spoken. Now, Lord of the Rings enjoyed its main popularity in the United States during the paperback revolution of the 60s. And when Dungeons and Dragons came out somewhat later, it was evident that orcs would, of course, be in it. Here's a picture from very early orcs. This is 1978, Monster Manual for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. As you can see, these orcs don't resemble Tolkien's orcs that much. These are some kind of sad-looking pigmen, merely beasts that somewhat sadly seem to be going about their business, quite warlike business still. Even the descriptions in the books at that time were not that close to Tolkien's descriptions. These were monsters who enjoyed living in tribes, enjoyed war, and were just violent and vile. They were there for the player characters to kill. But as time passes, we go a bit further. Here is from the late 80s, the orcs are quite far from the pigmen of early D&D. These ones managed to go via as many racist stereotypes as possible already, pointing here and there and there. And as time passes, they get more and more of Tolkien's descriptives. Here you can already see an orc that resembles what Tolkien said quite well. And towards current orcs, we go even further. Of course, orcs with TSR and later Wizards of the Coast were not just in the games. There were multiple other avenues for them to show up. For example, TSR/WotC novels. Hundreds of novels in different settings. And by this time, orcs had become so popular that even in some settings that had no orcs, authors creating novels for those settings just forgot that, these settings don't have orcs and wrote them in still. And even so, orcs continue being pure abjects in these works. They are there for the heroes to slaughter. They are there as the evil antagonists. They are there to be mass murdered as enemies. Their skin color was allowed to range freely in most of these. The attempt to remove skin color as a point was botched quite much by adding multiple new layers of racist imagery. Of course, here as well as in anything, there are exceptions. There were novels in which there were orcs who were not just pure abjects, who were there as characters also, but the mainstay of this time is still orc as an enemy that was created and maintained based on African stereotypes of the early 20th century. Now, this of course is not the only orc narrative that there is, and other orc franchises or franchises with orcs were born quite early. So Wizards of the Coast addressing this situation in the 2020s, it is welcome, but it's long overdue compared to some other companies. So let's take a look into these other narratives. Already in 1980s, Games Workshop created its own version of orcs for Warhammer Fantasy Battle and its sister game Warhammer 40k. When constructing this narrative, Games Workshop took a long look at what orcs are, what orcs were, and reconstructed them. In quite a short order, we have arrived to the Warhammer 40k orcs, happy fungi-based space hooligans, based quite much on British football hooligans. These are the happy orcs. They go around the galaxy enjoying fighting, talking in football hooligan lingo, and so on. This is already very far from what Tolkien envisioned. Here we have the green skin instead of black or dark, part of which, of course, is that green looks quite good painted on miniatures. Here we have the parodical take on an evil, monstrous race that goes around plundering and making war in a galaxy that itself is a parodical take on science fantasy empires and galaxies. Now, the boom of humanizing monsters was popularized in the late 70s by Anne Rice's interview with the vampire and continued to other kinds of monsters after vampires. With green-skinned humanoids that are typically portrayed in enjoying eating human flesh and being savage monsters, the trend, of course, started with Shrek, an immensely popular figure in movies. Now, Shrek, of course, is a totally humanized monster, kind of someone who draws the sympathies of the viewer to himself. Shrek was not how the boom ended. In the fantastic, the boom has continued with, for example, the Warcraft series, and especially World of Warcraft. Now, the first two Warcraft games were kind of more typical for Warhammer Fantasy type of fantasy battle in which hilariously evil orcs war with the humans. In Warcraft 3, this situation changes somewhat. Warcraft 3 is the most popular version of the Orcish Moses story. An orc rises within the orc society, trying to lead their people away from humans to live somewhere else, to live as savage nobles in some place where no one else resides. Warcraft 3 was already immensely popular, but World of Warcraft popularized that even more. Any player can create their own character from a multitude of monstrous or non-monstrous species, whether typical humans or dwarves or gnomes, or from bestial races such as orcs or undead and so on. And being able to create your own orc is one of the most humanizing aspects you can think of for a fantasy character. Now, this of course did not come out of nowhere. In books, we have had the stories humanizing orcs in, for example, Mere Gentle's Grunts, in which orcs gain memories and traumas of Vietnam veterans. We have had the first popular case of the orcish Moses story in Stan Nichols' Bodyguard of the Lightning and the whole Orcs series. And we have had a multitude of role-playing games in which orcs have been main characters among any other main characters, such as Shadowrun here from FASA, a game of cyberpunk with races of the monsters. In addition, there have been so many examples of orcs player characters in other game series. Elder Scrolls, for example, in which orcs have been a possible player character race from Elder Scrolls 3 to Elder Scrolls Online. Other games in which orcs have been portrayed as a kind of a more of a class issue than a racial stereotype, and so on. So thus, while the move of Wizards of the Coast to remove their stereotypes from orcs and some other races that have been portrayed in a historically racist way are very, very welcome. They are quite overdue and very well already done in some other game series, in other movies, in other books, in other fantastic arts. Now, of course, orcs are not the only race in the fantastic in which this kind of a problematic portrayal appears. There are multiple cases of, for example, how the Romani people are described in the fantastic, and there are other stereotypizing from the times the fantastic races were brought into fantasy. I'm now quickly looking into one of those, which is goblins. Goblins, of course, been there in fantasy from folklore. They have been in multiple tales told for thousands of years and so on. In fantasy, however, they have gotten into them some very harmful racial stereotypes that have been used. This is something I have called the Shylock syndrome. So, goblins in fantasy, of course, have been that. They have been many different things that have shared some attributes, especially if we now talk about British folklore. In addition, similar creatures have been in German folklore around Europe, and so on. However, when collecting that folklore, in quite many earlier story collections, along stories of goblins, among stories in which heroes cleverly beat some goblins, there have also been stories in which Jewish people have been the antagonists. No one in this age would print original Grimm's tales collections, including some of those tales in which the protagonist haunts Jews. And of course, the stereotypes have been there in European cultures for centuries and centuries. Very harmful stereotypes, and they have endued in, for example, here pictures from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, and all sharing the same racist signifiers. Here are three propaganda posters, two from Germany and one from the Soviet Union, and you can see the same signifiers there, the same racist signifiers. Now, let's come to modern age fantasy. Let's take, for example, Harry Potter films, the banker goblins, all with the same racist signifiers, bent backs, hook noses, pot bellies, all the same ones that have been used in anti-Semitic propaganda. Let's go to other fantastic races. Here are some Ferengi. These are from Star Trek Deep Space Nine, typically portrayed as merchants or bankers, greedy ones with the same racist signifiers. Or greedy, non-human, often with very questionable manners, without morals. So this picture is from World of Warcraft. At times portrayed as inventors. For example, Spider-Man's Green Goblin type, the same signifiers again and again. Sometimes these descriptives go so overboard that they the portrayals into public discussion. For example, here is Watto from Star Wars 1 Phantom Menace. Again, same physical descriptives, signifiers, again, the same social signifiers, again, greedy, somewhat evil, petty, and so on. So, all in all, there is still very much work to do with these stereotypes in fantasy, whether they are games, books, or whatnot. So, that was my very brief introduction into racism in fantasy. Due to the time limit, this was, of course, just scratching the surface, and there are also many exceptions, but there are also many such stereotypes in fantasy. Now, there are two main problems here, which together create a third one. First, having an evil human or humanoid race, which in itself is evil by nature, by culture, by birth, is problematic. Having these evil races define their individuals to be nothing but something slaughtered by the good heroes who come into their homes and plunder their riches, based on simply the fact that, of course, this was a member of this evil race. It must be killed. It's okay to loot their stuff. The second bigger problem is in that many of these evil races are based on racist stereotypes, racist signifiers added by authors 100 years ago or whenever into something that is fantastic, fantastic abject, in which everything evil and vile is pushed in. And together, these create the third main problem, due to which Wizards of the Coast is finally taking action, which is having these evil, monstrous races be based on human racist stereotypes. It is okay to go kill and plunder because they are this. It is a good time for Wizards of the Coast to take action on this. It should have been soon, and the discussion is not yet done. Thank you.